When I first moved into the neighborhood, everything seemed picture perfect. Rows of pristine houses lined the streets, manicured lawns shone like emerald carpets, and flower beds bloomed in perfect symmetry. It was the kind of suburban dream people imagined when they thought about the good life. Families waved as they drove past, children rode bikes along the sidewalks, and there was always the faint hum of sprinklers watering lawns that already looked flawless. At first glance, it felt safe, orderly, and peaceful. That was before I learned what really went on beneath the surface. It all started with a letter, a plain white envelope slipped neatly into my mailbox with the HOA's official logo stamped in bold blue across the corner. I hadn't been in the house long, just a few weeks, still settling into the rhythms of the neighborhood when I received it. At first, I assumed it was something routine, maybe a welcome packet or a notice about trash collection days. But when I opened it, the tone was far from welcoming. The letter stated, in stiff, formal language, that I was in violation of the neighborhood's regulations because of my dog, Max. According to the HOA, he was considered a dangerous breed and therefore not permitted to live in the community. I read the words 3 times over, disbelief washing over me. Max was a rescue, a gentle, loving companion who had never shown aggression toward anyone. He was big, yes, and his appearance alone often led strangers to assume he was intimidating, but those who knew him understood he was a sweetheart at heart. Still, the letter left no room for misunderstanding. They demanded I remove him from my property within 30 days or face escalating fines followed by legal action if I refused. It felt absurd. This was my home, and Max was my family. There was no way I would give him up, not for the whims of a homeowners association that barely knew me. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a mistake, some kind of clerical error. Perhaps they confused me with another resident, or maybe the breed list hadn't been updated in years. But as the days passed, I noticed the way neighbors glanced at me when I walked Max down the street. Whispers followed us, hushed voices that quieted the moment I looked their way. Parents pulled their children a little closer, and some homeowners even crossed the street entirely. That was when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was targeted. A week later, another envelope arrived, this one stamped "Second Notice." The letter was harsher this time, warning that daily fines would soon begin accumulating if I did not comply. The HOA president's name was scrawled at the bottom, a signature that carried weight in the community. I had never met her, but already I had heard her reputation whispered among neighbors. Strict, controlling, and relentless when it came to enforcing her version of order. Suddenly, the neighborhood didn't feel so idyllic anymore. The smiling faces seemed forced, the neat lawns like masks hiding something darker underneath. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been chosen as their next target, that Max was just the excuse they were using to wedge me out. I decided to fight back, though at the time I didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went. I began by reading through the HOA's bylaws, a tedious document full of legal jargon and fine print. Buried within it was a vague clause about dangerous animals, but nowhere did it define what constituted danger. There was no official breed list, no clear guidelines, just broad language that gave the board all the power and homeowners none. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. These rules weren't written to protect the community. They were written to control it. And suddenly I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The same few people always seemed to be in charge of meetings. Decisions were made behind closed doors, with little explanation offered to the rest of the residents. And the fines. Oh, the fines were endless. People whispered about neighbors who had been forced to sell their homes after thousands of dollars in penalties piled up from minor infractions like mismatched mailboxes or holiday decorations left out too long. The pattern was clear. The HOA thrived on fear and control. I tried reaching out to the president, hoping reason might work where rules failed. I left voicemails, sent polite emails, even stopped by the HOA office. Every attempt went unanswered. The silence felt intentional, like they wanted me to feel powerless, like they were daring me to defy them. But then something strange happened. An older neighbor approached me one evening as I was out with Max. She glanced around nervously before speaking, her voice hushed as though someone might be listening. She warned me that the HOA had done this before, using their vague rules to push out homeowners they didn't like. Some, she hinted, had left quietly. Others had fought back and paid dearly. Then she said something that stuck with me. If you dig deep enough, you'll see what they're really hiding. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but her words lit a fire in me. This wasn't just about Max anymore. This was about something bigger, something that smelled of corruption, power, and greed. As I walked back home that evening, Max trotting happily beside me, I realized that giving him up wasn't just unthinkable, it was exactly what they wanted, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. That night, I sat at my desk, spreading the HOA documents out before me, highlighting inconsistencies and jotting down notes. Somewhere in those pages or in the way the board operated, there had to be a weakness, a thread I could pull that would unravel everything. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to uncover secrets that would shake the entire neighborhood. And the first crack in their perfect facade was about to appear.
The next morning, the neighborhood looked the same as always. Pristine lawns, polished cars, and trimmed hedges. But for me, the illusion was broken. Every picket fence and decorative wreath felt like part of a stage set, carefully maintained to distract from the rot behind the curtain. My mind was fixed on the HOA's letters and the old neighbor's warning. If they had used vague rules to target others, then surely I wasn't the first person to resist. I started with the documents. The HOA bylaws, covenants, and enforcement policies filled a binder as thick as a dictionary. I spent hours combing through every section, highlighting contradictions and vague wording. One detail stood out immediately. The so-called dangerous breed clause had been inserted just 3 years earlier. Before that, the bylaws only prohibited animals that cause a nuisance. The change seemed rushed, tacked on to the end of the section with no supporting notes or explanation. Why would they suddenly add such a clause? And more importantly, who pushed for it? I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a space designed to look welcoming, but that always felt more like a courtroom. The board sat behind a long, folding table, papers stacked neatly in front of them, while residents took their seats in rows of metal chairs. The president presided at the center, her posture rigid, her expression stern, like a teacher waiting to scold misbehaving students. When the meeting began, the agenda was rushed through with little room for discussion. Landscaping contracts, parking violations, budget adjustments, it was all presented as a done deal, with residents barely given a chance to ask questions. I noticed how quickly the board voted, often unanimously, and how dismissively they brushed aside concerns from the floor. I waited for the moment when they opened the floor to general comments. When my turn came, I raised the issue of the dangerous breed clause. The room fell silent. The president leaned forward, her voice cool, as she recited the same line from the letter I had received. The rules were in place for the safety of the community. She offered no further clarification, no evidence, and when I pressed her for a definition of what counted as dangerous, she cut me off and moved to the next speaker. The tension was palpable. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some sympathetic, others wary, as though I'd crossed an invisible line. But I wasn't deterred. If anything, the president's evasiveness only confirmed what I already suspected. The rule was never about safety. It was about power. After the meeting, I lingered outside the clubhouse. A few residents approached me quietly, each sharing their own frustrations with the board. One woman told me she had been fined hundreds of dollars for leaving a garden gnome on her porch, deemed an unauthorized decoration. Another whispered about being forced to repaint her shutters because the shade of blue she chose was non-compliant. Their stories varied, but the theme was the same: arbitrary enforcement, inconsistent rules, and punishments designed to intimidate. That night, I started making calls. I reached out to county offices, requesting public records related to the HOA's filings and amendments. I spent hours on homeowners forums, reading posts from people in other communities who had faced similar situations. Again and again, I saw the same story: power-hungry boards using vague rules to bully residents, all while hiding behind legal jargon and intimidation tactics. But then, I stumbled onto something that made my stomach turn. A financial report from the HOA filed with the county showed an unusual pattern of expenses. Legal fees were through the roof, far higher than what a typical neighborhood association should be spending. The report listed thousands of dollars in compliance enforcement costs, but provided no breakdown of where the money was actually going. It didn't add up. Either the board was funneling money into something they didn't want residents to see, or they were hiring outside help to enforce their rules in a way that was never disclosed. I realized then that this wasn't just about Max. This was about money, control, and possibly corruption. The more I uncovered, the more I understood why the old neighbor had warned me. Anyone who dug too deep became a threat to the board's control, and threats had a way of being silenced, whether through fines, lawsuits, or sheer intimidation. Still, I pressed forward. I began keeping a log of everything: letters from the HOA, conversations with neighbors, notes from meetings, even photos of violations that were ignored when committed by board members themselves. The hypocrisy was staggering. One board member had a dog that clearly exceeded the community's weight limit, yet no fines were ever issued. Another had built an unauthorized shed in his backyard, while other residents were fined for leaving trash bins visible for an hour too long. The rules weren't rules at all. They were weapons wielded selectively to maintain dominance. As my evidence grew, so did the tension. I noticed board members' cars slowing down in front of my house, their drivers glaring before driving off. Max barked once at one of them, and within 2 days another letter appeared in my mailbox, accusing me of harboring a nuisance animal. It was harassment, plain and simple, but it only fueled my determination. It became clear that I couldn't win this battle alone. The board thrived on isolating residents, making each person feel like they were fighting an unwinnable war. But if I could bring others together, if I could show them the truth, then maybe, just maybe, we could expose what the HOA had been hiding all along. Late one night, as I sat surrounded by binders, highlighters, and notes scattered across my dining table, I realized what my next step needed to be. If the board was going to bury me in legal threats, then I would bring in someone who understood their game, someone who could dismantle their facade with the very laws they twisted to their advantage. I needed a lawyer. And with the right one on my side, I suspect we could uncover far more than the board ever intended to reveal.
Finding the right lawyer wasn't easy. Most attorneys I called either dismissed my concerns as a small HOA dispute or warned me that fighting an association was a costly uphill battle. But I wasn't looking for someone to win me a quick settlement. I wanted someone who could expose the rot festering beneath the surface. Eventually, I found her, a real estate attorney who specialized in homeowner disputes and had a reputation for taking on cases others avoided. When I explained my situation, she didn't laugh it off or tell me to surrender. Instead, she asked for every document I had collected: letters, meeting notes, financial reports, and photos. I handed over a stack so thick it nearly spilled off her desk. She leafed through the papers silently, her brow furrowing as she scanned line after line. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and said something that confirmed everything I suspected. This board is overstepping their authority, and if what you've gathered here checks out, we might be looking at more than just harassment. We could be looking at financial misconduct. With her guidance, my fight began to take shape. The first step was to challenge the legality of the dangerous breed clause. According to her, the clause was too vague to be enforceable in court. There was no official breed list, no definition of what constituted dangerous, and no documented incidents involving Max. In short, the HOA had created a rule designed to intimidate rather than protect, and the lack of clarity could easily be used against them. But my lawyer didn't stop there. She instructed me to file formal requests for the HOA's financial records, board meeting minutes, and voting tallies on amendments. Homeowners had the right to access these documents under state law, though most never realized it. If the board refused, it would only strengthen our case. Within days of those requests being sent, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The board's president, who had once ignored my calls, now seemed fixated on me. New violation notices appeared in my mailbox almost weekly. Claims that my grass was too long, that my trash bins weren't pulled in fast enough, even that my mailbox paint was fading. Each notice came with the threat of fines, yet when I inspected my property, everything was immaculate. It was harassment disguised as procedure. Neighbors began noticing too. Some whispered encouragement when no one else was around, telling me to keep pushing. Others warned me to be careful, that the board had ways of making life miserable for anyone who challenged them. I could feel the invisible pressure building, but with my lawyer by my side, I refused to back down. Weeks passed, and slowly cracks in the HOA's armor began to show. When my lawyer followed up on our requests, the board delayed and stonewalled, claiming the documents weren't available or needed additional review. But state law was clear. They were required to provide them. Their refusal only raised more questions. Then came the breakthrough. My lawyer obtained copies of past budgets and expense reports that revealed staggering legal costs. Tens of thousands of dollars had been spent each year on enforcement, far beyond what was reasonable for a community of our size. The money trail suggested something more sinister, that fines and threats weren't just about control, they were a revenue stream. The more we dug, the clearer the picture became. The board appeared to be funneling money into the same law firm over and over again, a firm with suspiciously close ties to the president's own family. Residents' fines and fees were being used not just to maintain order, but to enrich a select few at the top. The realization was infuriating. All those neighbors fined for garden gnomes, mismatched shutters, or Christmas lights left up too long weren't just victims of petty rules, they were being exploited. With evidence mounting, my lawyer recommended a bold next step: file a formal complaint to the state's regulatory agency and alert the community. But she warned me that going public would escalate everything. The board wouldn't take it lightly. They would fight harder, and they would make me a target. I knew she was right. But by then, I wasn't just fighting for Max. I was fighting for every family that had been bullied, fined, or driven out by the HOA's tactics. Someone had to shine a light on their corruption, and I had already come too far to back down. So we drafted a letter to every homeowner in the community. In it, we outlined the vague dangerous breed clause, the inconsistent enforcement of rules, and the financial irregularities we had uncovered. We included copies of the records, highlighted suspicious expenditures, and urged residents to demand answers. On the day the letters were delivered, the neighborhood was buzzing. Groups of homeowners gathered in driveways, papers in hand, pointing to numbers and shaking their heads in disbelief. For the first time since I had moved in, the silence was broken. People were angry, not at me, but at the board that had lorded over them for so long. That evening, the president herself showed up at my door. She didn't knock politely, she banged, hard enough to rattle the frame. When I opened it, her face was tight with rage, her words sharp as she accused me of spreading lies and slander. But I didn't argue. Instead, I handed her a copy of the very documents her own board had filed. Watching her expression falter even for a split second was proof enough that we were on the right track. After she stormed off, I knew the war had truly begun. The HOA wasn't going to let go of their power easily. But now, for the first time, the residents weren't looking at me with suspicion. They were looking at the board with doubt. And doubt, I realized, was the beginning of change. What I didn't know then was just how deep their secrets went and how far they would go to protect them.
The morning after the letters went out, the neighborhood no longer felt the same. The carefully constructed illusion of harmony had cracked, and the air carried a different kind of tension. Homeowners who once looked away when the board's name was mentioned were now openly murmuring, swapping stories, and comparing fines. Driveways turned into small gathering places where stacks of papers were passed around like contraband. For the first time, the board was not the only voice being heard. But the board struck back quickly. Within days, new violation notices flooded my mailbox. This time they were almost comical in their pettiness. According to the papers, my lawn was half an inch above regulation length. My trash bins were left visible for 3 minutes longer than permitted, and my mailbox flag was faded and non-compliant. Each notice came with a fine, and each fine stacked onto the last. It was harassment on paper, a weaponized bureaucracy designed to break me down. My lawyer, however, was prepared. She advised me to log every notice, photograph every alleged violation, and document the timing of each delivery. Soon, I had a binder full of evidence that painted a clear picture: selective enforcement bordering on obsession. The retaliation didn't stop with paperwork. Strange things began happening around my property. My sprinkler system, which had worked flawlessly for weeks, suddenly malfunctioned, flooding part of the yard. Packages went missing from my porch. Max's leash, which I always hung by the back door, was found lying in the middle of my driveway one morning, though I hadn't left it there. These incidents might have been coincidences, but taken together, they felt like intimidation tactics. Neighbors started approaching me more openly. One man admitted he had been fined nearly $1,000 over the course of a year for parking his truck slightly over the driveway line. Another woman revealed that she had been forced to remove a small vegetable garden she had planted for her children because the board claimed it disrupted the aesthetic. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns of control and financial exploitation. The community was beginning to stir, but the board clung to its power with claws. At the next HOA meeting, the president opened with a long speech denouncing misinformation and malicious rumors. She accused unnamed residents, though everyone knew she meant me, of trying to destabilize the community for personal gain. She spoke with the authority of someone used to being believed, her words dripping with indignation. But this time, something remarkable happened. Residents didn't sit in silence. Hands shot up, voices rose, and questions cut through her carefully rehearsed speech. People demanded to know why legal fees were so high, why enforcement was so selective, and why their requests for financial transparency had been delayed. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for the sudden wave of defiance. I sat quietly, letting the others speak. The tide had shifted, and for once, the president couldn't silence it with a dismissive wave of her hand. Still, the retaliation intensified. A few days later, I received a certified letter claiming the board had voted to place a lien on my property for unpaid fines. According to them, my balance had already exceeded several $1,000s, despite the fact that most of the notices were baseless. My lawyer assured me the lien wouldn't hold up in court, but it was a scare tactic, a way to pressure me into backing down. That same week, I learned something that turned suspicion into certainty. A neighbor who worked in accounting quietly slipped me a copy of a financial ledger he had managed to obtain. It detailed payments from the HOA to a law firm, payments far exceeding the amounts reported in official filings. The firm was run by none other than the president's brother-in-law. The connection was undeniable. Residents weren't just being fined into submission, they were being milked to fund a family scheme. When I shared the information with my lawyer, she nodded grimly. "This," she said, "is fraud. If we can get more residents on record, we could have grounds for a full investigation." The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had wanted to defend Max, to fight back against the absurdity of their rules. But now I was standing on the edge of something bigger, something that could topple the HOA entirely. News of the ledger spread quietly, like a spark catching dry grass. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began speaking louder, their fear giving way to anger. The HOA's threats no longer carried the same weight. At night, I could hear conversations drifting across lawns, people sharing their stories of unfair treatment, all threaded together by a common realization. We had been used. Still, the board wasn't finished. One evening, as I returned home from a late meeting with my lawyer, I found a notice taped to my front door. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten in bold, angry strokes. "You're making a mistake. Stop now or regret it." The message chilled me. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. I reported the incident to the police, but without proof, there was little they could do. My lawyer urged me to stay focused. Fear was exactly what the board wanted me to feel. If I backed down now, everything we had built, the evidence, the momentum, the residents' newfound courage would collapse. So I pressed forward. Together with my lawyer, we began preparing a formal complaint to the state regulatory agency, complete with financial discrepancies, selective enforcement logs, and testimonies from residents. The case was building into something undeniable. But the board had one more move left. At the next HOA meeting, they unveiled a new amendment proposal, one that would grant the board expanded authority to fine residents without warning and restrict access to financial records entirely. It was a desperate attempt to tighten their grip before it slipped away. The room erupted in outrage. Residents who had once sat silently now shouted in defiance. The president banged her gavel, her face flushed with fury, but her control was slipping through her fingers. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The board wasn't just fighting me. They were fighting to keep the entire community blind to the empire they had built on fear and money. The battle lines were drawn. The residents were awake. And the HOA's secrets were about to come crashing into the light.
The board's attempt to seize more power backfired spectacularly. Their proposal to expand authority and restrict access to records did not rally the community, it enraged it. For years, residents had quietly tolerated fines, restrictions, and intimidation because they assumed resistance was futile. But now, armed with proof of corruption and emboldened by their shared frustration, they were no longer afraid. In the days after that heated meeting, the neighborhood was alive with whispered conversations, pointed stares, and subtle acts of defiance. Christmas lights reappeared in July. Garden gnomes cropped up on porches like mushrooms after rain. Even the strictest rule followers began bending the regulations as if to say, "Your control doesn't scare us anymore." For the first time since moving in, I felt the community forming bonds not around appearances or rules, but around defiance. People who had barely spoken to one another were suddenly united, and the board, so accustomed to ruling from above, was starting to lose its grip. My lawyer and I moved quickly. With testimonies from multiple residents, detailed financial discrepancies, and evidence of selective enforcement, we filed a formal complaint with the state's regulatory agency. It was no longer just about my dog Max, or even about my own fines. This was about systemic abuse of power. The response was swift. The agency acknowledged our complaint and opened a preliminary review. That alone was enough to send shockwaves through the community. For the first time, the board's authority was being challenged by a force larger than themselves. The president, however, did not retreat quietly. She doubled down. Notices warning of community destabilization began circulating, painting me as a troublemaker and accusing me of jeopardizing property values. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a bulletin board appeared with bold letters, "Preserve our community, say no to lies." Flyers soon followed, slipped into mailboxes, filled with half-truths and outright fabrications. But the harder she pushed, the weaker her position became. The residents had seen the documents. They had read the ledgers, heard the testimonies, and compared their own experiences. They knew the truth now, and no flyer could erase it.
As weeks passed, the regulatory agency began requesting additional records. The board stalled, as they always had, but the pressure mounted. Rumors swirled that auditors would soon visit in person. For the first time, it wasn't just residents questioning the board's authority, it was the state. Meanwhile, the personal intimidation against me escalated. Anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox, warning me to move out while I still could. One evening, I found tire tracks tearing across my front lawn, as if someone had driven deliberately over it. Another night, I heard footsteps outside my window, though when I rushed to look, no one was there. These acts of harassment were designed to shake me, to convince me the fight wasn't worth it. But I was no longer alone. Neighbors began walking Max with me, their presence both protective and symbolic. Others offered to keep an eye on my house when I was away. What had begun as my personal battle had grown into a collective resistance. The board had tried to isolate me, but instead, they had united the entire neighborhood against them. The turning point came during the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. Word had spread about the state's investigation, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The president tried to maintain her usual composure, her voice crisp as she dismissed the rumors and insisted everything was business as usual. But when residents began demanding answers, why legal fees were siphoning so much of the budget, why financial records were incomplete, why violations were enforced selectively, her mask cracked. Her responses grew sharper, more defensive. She raised her voice, waved her hands, and accused the residents of betrayal. But each outburst only confirmed what everyone already suspected. She was losing control. Then, in the middle of the meeting, my lawyer stood up. Calmly, she outlined the state's investigation, the evidence we had submitted, and the potential consequences for financial misconduct. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The president's face drained of color as she realized this was no longer just neighborhood gossip, it was official. The board tried to adjourn the meeting abruptly, but residents refused to leave. They demanded transparency, shouted for resignations, and for the first time, the board members looked genuinely shaken. Their power, once absolute, was slipping through their fingers. Afterwards, the neighborhood buzzed with energy. Some called it the turning of the tide. People who had once been too scared to speak now shared their stories openly. Every tale added another piece to the puzzle of corruption. The more that surfaced, the clearer it became. The board had not been protecting the community, they had been exploiting it. But victory was not yet certain. My lawyer warned me that people like this didn't go down easily. They would fight tooth and nail, using every trick at their disposal to maintain control. The threats might intensify, the fines might multiply, but the truth was out, and that truth was our shield. As summer stretched on, the investigation deepened. Officials requested interviews with residents, subpoenaed financial records, and began piecing together a timeline of misconduct. Each step brought us closer to exposing the full scope of what had been happening behind the scenes. At home, I often caught myself watching Max as he lounged in the yard, oblivious to the storm swirling around us. The fight had started with him, his place in my home, his right to live beside me without being branded dangerous. But now it was about so much more. It was about fairness, about neighbors reclaiming their voices, about tearing down a system built on intimidation and greed. And as the walls closed in on the board, I felt a shift. For the first time, the fear was no longer mine to carry. It was theirs. But what none of us knew then was just how desperate they would become and how far they were willing to go before the end.
The HOA's empire of intimidation, secrecy, and greed was crumbling. What had once seemed like an untouchable council of power-hungry neighbors was now little more than a desperate group scrambling to control the narrative. The town that had once whispered compliance into silence was now roaring with outrage, and it all started with a dog they tried to label dangerous. The news of the HOA's corruption had spread far beyond the community's gates. Articles popped up online detailing the forged invoices, the bribes disguised as maintenance fees, and the self-serving decisions masked as safety regulations.
Local television reporters interviewed frustrated residents who, for years, had paid outrageous dues without ever questioning where the money was going. Now every voice rose against the board, and the carefully polished veneer of order shattered like fragile glass. The HOA attempted damage control. Evelyn, the president, released carefully worded statements claiming everything was a misunderstanding and that the community was simply re-evaluating certain rules. But no one was fooled anymore. Residents remembered every fine, every threatening letter, every humiliation disguised as standards. Evelyn's words rang hollow, and the more she spoke, the angrier the neighborhood grew. The very people who had once silently complied with her rules were now showing up at meetings with folders of evidence, demanding answers. The turning point came during what was supposed to be an emergency HOA assembly. The board, still clinging to authority, sat behind their long table at the front of the clubhouse, paper stacked neatly before them, their expressions stiff. But when the room filled with dozens of residents, the energy was different. Instead of the usual quiet acceptance, there was electricity in the air. People weren't afraid anymore. They were ready for a reckoning. One by one, neighbors stood up. Some recounted how they had been fined hundreds of dollars for the smallest infractions: flowers planted outside the approved pallet, a forgotten trash can on the curb, or a holiday decoration taken down one day too late. Others shared how they had been bullied into silence when they dared question the board's decisions. It became clear that the HOA's so-called leadership had built its power on fear, intimidation, and fabricated authority. And then came the evidence. With every folder opened and every paper held high, Evelyn and her board shrank further into their chairs. There were photocopies of altered receipts, bank statements showing personal purchases made with community funds, and written threats sent to residents who had dared to ask too many questions. The truth was undeniable, and for once, the HOA's carefully constructed wall of secrecy was gone. The lawyer I had hired, who had initially been brought in just to defend my right to keep Max, now stood before the room as the final nail in their coffin. He presented the case clearly and methodically, walking everyone through how the HOA had violated its own bylaws, broken state housing regulations, and embezzled funds from the very people they were supposed to represent. His calm, precise tone cut through the air like a blade, dismantling the board's credibility piece by piece. When he finally concluded, the silence in the room was heavy. It was the kind of silence that precedes an irreversible decision. Then slowly, residents began clapping. The sound grew louder, stronger, until it shook the walls of the clubhouse. It wasn't just applause. It was liberation. The HOA board, once feared, was now ridiculed. Evelyn's face turned pale as she realized her control had slipped through her fingers for good. The following weeks moved quickly. Investigations were opened by county officials and subpoenas were issued. Evelyn and her allies were forced to step down, their reputations destroyed, their actions no longer shielded by the illusion of authority. A temporary committee of residents took over, people who had once been voiceless but now found strength in unity. They promised transparency, fairness, and above all, a community free from the tyranny that had ruled it for too long. Max became something of a neighborhood symbol. Where he had once been labeled as dangerous, he was now greeted with smiles and pats on the head every time we went on a walk. Neighbors who never spoke to me before now stopped to thank me for standing up when no one else dared. Children played with him in the park, and even the older residents who had once whispered complaints about his breed now admitted that he was gentler than most people they knew. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a reminder that standing against injustice mattered, no matter how small it seemed at the start. As life slowly returned to normal, I often thought back to how it all began. The letters, the threats, the absurd claim that my loyal companion was a danger to the community. If I had given in, if I had let fear guide me, none of this would have come to light. The HOA would still be pocketing money, intimidating residents, and hiding behind their false authority. But instead, the truth had been dragged into the light.
And it all started because I refused to abandon my dog. The HOA tried to ban my dog. Instead, I brought in a lawyer, uncovered their secrets, and watched their empire collapse. Max stretched out in the cool evening air, content and safe. I looked out over the community that had once been fractured by fear, now stitched together by truth, and smiled. The war was over, and this time, the right side had won.